to the first in our series on revolutions in the modern world. Though often conflated with civil unrest and disorder for our purposes, a revolution means a shift in the way the world is perceived and operates. The early modern period is ushered in, for example, when cultures begin to explore the wider world, not just the fringes of their borders, well beyond any of what their people would have done on a regular basis. More importantly, they recorded their explorations and brought them back for their society to experience. What that society does with the information is irrelevant. The genie is already out of the bottle, and the age of exploration is on, and that is why this period is so revolutionary. Before we dive too far in, a few things need to be said about this lecture. Sure, the periods we're studying begin at 1500, but that's an arbitrary date. As with many things arbitrary, they don't really have a good reason. Therefore, since nothing special occurs in 1500, at least not special enough for us to warrant to start at this date, we're going to turn the clock back a little bit. Why? Because context matters. Changes in human behavior don't just suddenly crop up out of nowhere. They are influenced. Indeed, they are set in motion by actions and events that preceded them. History doesn't occur in a vacuum. This is a theme that runs through not just this class, but through all truly historical analysis. Anyone who tells you X happened out of nowhere and was a complete surprise doesn't correctly grasp history, or they're trying to mislead and deceive you. In a similar way, we have to be clear on how we use our language as historians, and we have to be careful in explaining why a word we use is the way it's used. Much like I explained why directly exploring other countries is considered a revolution and differentiated it from civil unrest and violence, we have to be clear in our use of words and what they mean. A great example for this lecture is the word discovery. In one sense, discovery can mean the first time something is found to exist, a wholly new revelation, if you will. The discovery of fire, the discovery of the cure for polio, the discovery of black holes, and so on. In another sense, however, discovery can mean the first time a certain set of people become aware of a thing. For example, if I said, I discovered hot wings, I really love them, you wouldn't assume that I invented them. Similarly, we can say that Christopher Columbus discovered America and be making a true statement if we qualify it properly. While the qualification on my hot wing statement is kind of inferred, the qualification for Columbus needs to be expressed. We could say Christopher Columbus's voyage resulted in the European discovery of a new landmass that they had not known existed before. It was such a revelation that Europeans began to refer to it as the New World. So in that way, he did kind of discover the New World, at least from the perspective of Europeans. Understanding how to use language properly is also an important part of this course and being a historian. It will come up later in this course as we tackle other words, ideas, and concepts. Now on to the context. One of the most famous explorers is not in the 15th century at all, but rather the late 13th and early 14th century, a period after the Mongol conquest during the latter years of what historians refer to as Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. This allowed a European trader to make a 2.5-year journey from Italy to China. Marco Polo isn't the first European, not even the first person to travel this length. His own father and uncle have been making similar trips for decades. So what makes Marco Polo different? Well, two things. First, he stayed a very, very long time in the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and Emperor of China. All told, Marco Polo spent about 24 years in China as part guest, part hostage to Kublai Khan. Marco Polo returned to Italy as a middle-aged man, and though imprisoned as a spy by Genoa, he wrote a book on his travels. This is the key to understanding what makes Marco stand out. He is documenting his experiences in foreign lands. It also occurs at a time when Italian city-states are extremely affluent and influential. His book, The Book of Marvels of the World, offers a glimpse into the wider world to Europeans in a manner that had not really happened before. His book and many of its reprints are, for better or for worse, part fact and part fiction interwoven into a very compelling narrative that sets him as the hero. So while it's not a true travelogue, it does inspire would-be explorers to consider the wider world outside the confines of Europe and the well-mapped shores of the Mediterranean. Somewhat less well known is the 14th century pilgrim turned wanderer Muhammad ibn Battuta. As a young man, his pilgrimage to Mecca, called the Hajj, began ordinarily enough. He was one of dozens who were making the trek to the holy city in accordance with Muslim tenets. What is unusual is that after he completes the difficult journey, he doesn't return home, but instead begins an exploration of all the places that Islam influences. He's able to parlay his status as al-Hajj, or somebody who successfully completed the pilgrimage, into various positions that allow him to accumulate money and acquaintances who then help him on his next leg of his journey. All told, his wanderlust would last about 30 years. He doesn't return to Morocco until his late 50s. Upon returning, he's ordered to write a book or account of his travels by the Sultan. This is done in part to justify his long absence from the Sultan's dominion, but also partly to glorify Morocco as a sophisticated worldly part of the Islamic world, and also to convey his story and experiences to kind of increase his reputation. Much like Marco Polo, his story is also rife with oddities and stretchings of the truth that strays into the fictional. But it also encourages other travelers to take comfort in how interconnected they are by virtue of being Muslim. That lone boy from Morocco can become a Chinese bureaucrat, an advisor to the Indian Mughal Empire, marry a Russian woman, a Mongol woman, and an African woman, and more. All they have to do is study and become knowledgeable scholars in their own right, and the world is their oyster. Now, while both Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta were single, unsponsored individuals whose stories fired the imagination of their respective societies, Zheng He was a true explorer. Sponsored by his government, in this case the Ming Dynasty, and commanding a fleet. His fleet was really massive too. Dozens of ships, ranging from water tankers to horse carriers to troop transports to his enormous flagship. The flagship had 9 masts and was capable of holding over 500 people. It was 417 feet, which is longer than a football field. We know that these ships were possible in China because other explorers, such as Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, write independently of each other that they had either witnessed or sailed upon ships that were capable of holding up to 1,000 people. And also because the commander, courtier turned admiral Zheng He, had kept meticulous notes and ledgers of the expedition, including repairs that needed to be done to the ships after storms. Furthermore, the ships came back bearing prizes, such as a pet giraffe from Africa. We know for a fact that he visited kingdoms and empires throughout Asia and Africa, but while the expedition did provide updated, detailed official maps and register each society he encountered, both large and small, it was not for the simple joy of exploration or discovery or to prove a theory. Rather, it was to display the might of China as a country and a culture. Zheng He showed up at any given port with a sizable army at his command. He would not hesitate to engage in violence and bullied his way across the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. Along the way, he severely impacted the activity of pirates and smugglers, so there's kind of a silver lining to this militaristic reputation. So great, we have this Chinese explorer with a massive fleet who is mapping the world. So what happened to all those Chinese explorers, though? Well, scholars are deeply divided on the why, but we do know that after he returned from his expeditions, the Chinese never really became a maritime trading power. Some historians say it was because when he returned, there was nothing he brought back to China that China didn't already have. So there was no wonder in his discovery. It didn't fire the imagination, basically. Also, he was a victim of partisan party politics. Rival factions within his government had gained influence during his absence, and when he returned, they made a 3-point argument. A, the the expedition was extremely expensive and thus a failure. So despite the maps, the creation of safer trading lanes, and so on, he had cost the government money. B, he violated tradition. Since China had never really been the one to go to other countries and beg for trade routes, he had denigrated the greatness of Chinese culture, and they aimed to make China great again by returning to an isolationist policy. And then finally, for he was audacious enough for being part of the wrong political party. His accomplishments were not only denigrated, but most of his records were then destroyed. The TLDR of this is that political theater and partisan loyalty kept China from becoming a maritime power. Instead, most of China's trade would come to it for several centuries until other powers who were happy to fill the void in maritime superiority came calling. At the same time Zheng He was making his voyages, the Portuguese were beginning to explore the coast of Africa. Well, why? Partly because a pair of hostile foreign powers, namely Spain and the Ottoman Empire, were blocking their access to the traditional Mediterranean routes. Also, the discovery of semi-tropical islands off the coast of Africa had allowed the Portuguese to kind of expand their territory and grow spices that had become scarce because of the poor trading conditions. Sponsored through royal authority, such as through the patronage of Prince Henry, who was nicknamed the Navigator because of his love of maps and exploration, the Portuguese had pushed the boundary of their world view. By the close of the 15th century, an explorer named Bartolomeo Diaz had made the treacherous journey south along the African coast. The ships he commanded were beset by misfortune, being blown off course and into the open ocean with little to navigate back towards the African coast. Worse, the sudden dangerous storms on the southern tip of Africa nearly destroyed his fleet. After connecting to the Indian Ocean, his crew and officers became restless and forced him to return to Portugal and thus safety. Though Diaz wanted to continue on to India, that journey would never manifest for him. Another explorer, building upon his discoveries, his maps, and his observations, would eventually land in India. Vasco da Gama would be the first European to sail directly to India, and through a combination of deception, he passed himself off as a Muslim at one point, but was found out and had to flee from the African coast. He engaged in piracy, and he became belligerent, holding ports hostage until they paid his price. He established a Portuguese presence in India that would last until the late 20th century. In fact, the last Portuguese holding was militarily taken over in 1979. All of this brings us to the most famous, for good or for ill, explorer in European history. Christopher Columbus had been trying for years to land a sponsorship from Italian princes, Spanish monarchs, and Portuguese potentates to gamble upon a more direct, and he argued easier, route to Asia by heading west into the Atlantic. Now, there's this myth that he was doing it for science, most famously proving that the world was round, but that's a straight up lie. Educated elites like the princes, queens, and kings that he was courting, as well as anybody who was interested in geography at all, such as Columbus, knew that the world was round. In fact, the Greeks had mathematically calculated thousands of years earlier and were actually pretty close in calculating the Earth's circumference. Most peasants and laborers probably didn't think the world was flat either. Most of them really didn't care enough to think about it. So where does that lie come from? Well, it was an effort to denigrate medieval society cooked up by critics of the Catholic Church, who were trying to paint the Catholic Church as an organization that keeps people ignorant. Never mind the fact that Columbus and the Spanish crown were both zealously Catholic in 1492. But I digress. Columbus benefited from the Renaissance, that is, the rediscovery of the earlier Greek and Roman learning, as well as the writings of Marco Polo, which he studied voraciously. He eventually convinced the king and queen of Spain, who themselves had found trading with the Ottoman Empire increasingly difficult due to their persecution of Jews and Muslims during the Spanish Inquisition, and they decided to sink money into his venture. Columbus's voyage therefore had a lot of things going for it. First, like Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, he would record his voyages. He sprinkled them liberally with fiction and fired up his successors' imaginations. Second, like Zheng He and Bartolomeo Diaz, he had secured royal government sponsorship, meaning his success or failure would be public knowledge. Third, he was gambling on the possibility of opening a new, non-monopolized trading route for his sponsor. The Mediterranean was dominated militarily by the Ottoman Empire and economically by the rich Italian city-states that could afford to punch above their weight militarily. And economically, a direct route promised cheaper, more profitable trade. Vasco da Gama, who I mentioned earlier, lost three-quarters of his ship and half of his men, and yet returned with enough spices, shipment of peppercorns in this case, the same black peppercorn that you have in a shaker right now, that his expedition turned a 300% profit after all the losses were accounted for. Who wouldn't want that? So there's a lot riding on this voyage. It's not terribly surprising then that when Columbus did make landfall in the Caribbean, that he named them the Indies and labeled the people living there the Indians, because he wanted to believe so much that he had made it to India that he fooled himself, his crew, and his sponsors with fake names and it wasn't until about a decade or so later that a cartographer using measurements and logs from Columbus and other explorers' logs that Amerigo Vespucci convincingly argued that the landmass Columbus had found was not Asia at all, but a separate landmass previously unknown to Europeans. It is from Amerigo that we get the name America, by the way. Columbus, however, did not discover an empty land. He found a hemisphere that had been occupied by people for over 50,000 years. This is where the discovery discussion needs to take place. When Columbus arrived, he had a slightly more technologically advanced society backing him. The transatlantic voyage alone is technically challenging, but that doesn't mean he met an ignorant people who were mired in the Stone Age and stupidity. He first encountered the Taino natives, who were an amalgam of island-dwelling groups not like Indonesia or Polynesia or some Mediterranean societies. They didn't have gunpowder, certainly, but their ability to navigate the waters and to prosper in a hurricane-prone region is testament to their ingenuity and adaptation. Similarly, further inland, there were empires, kingdoms, theocracies, and more cropping up and established complex, impressive cultures in North, Central, and South America alike. The Aztecs, Maya, Inca, Cahokia, Mississippi, and more established vast agrarian empires had cities that were not dissimilar to European cities in many ways, and in some cases were more advanced. For example, when the conquistadors of Cortez's retinue first gazed upon Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, they remarked that it looked like the city of Venice. It was orderly city blocks connected by complex canal systems. It had temples and palaces that were as tall as any cathedral. And better yet, it had a sewer system, the likes of which the Europeans wouldn't have until the 19th century. In reports to Europe, however, native tribes were often portrayed as barbarous and dangerous. The fiction of Polo and Ibn Battuta was kind of amplified on a wider scale. The writings of missionaries and conquistadors alike were intended to both titillate and offend their readers. So they told stories of cannibalism, open sexuality, worshiping stone idols, and more in order to provide some cover or some motivation for the interactions with the natives that happened. Some Europeans, such as Columbus, engaged in abhorrent atrocities, crucifying, raping, murdering, pillaging tribes that they encountered. The European reputation was so bad that the Aztecs, who themselves were not angels in any way, I mean, they performed human sacrifice and ripped beating hearts out of people. The Aztecs would label Europeans as demons and evil spirits and forbade their people from interacting with them except to kill them on sight. So let's stop here and consider another part of this week's assignments. The additional resources that are on Canvas are there to help you unpack a lot that we read, watch, and understand every week. I'll cover some of the items that we go over and highlight things that maybe don't quite make it into the books, or in some cases, I will give you context that you read to what you read in the book, or vice versa. Regardless, there's going to be gaps. And these gaps can be filled in with the resources that I put on the additional resources page. I ask you to watch them, read them, go over them, use them for your exams, and get the more full picture of the period and times that we cover. For example, you'll learn a little bit more about the native people of the Western Hemisphere and why Columbus Day is such a hot button issue right now. You'll also learn about the art and society and innovations of native people this week. So I want you to go there and check out all those resources after this lecture, which, by the way, is almost done. Sorry about that. I had a technical difficulty. Now, these diseases were terrible, and we have some contemporary writings from missionaries who set up hospitals, and they would rip through these communities in breathtaking speed. Uh, some people would feel fine in the morning, and they would be sick and dead by the evening. That is the most profound tragedy in the modern world. Even had the Europeans been merely peaceful traders, the death toll would have been horrific. Worse, to make matters much worse, later generations of Europeans would exploit this immunity gap by purposefully lacing blankets with diseases such as smallpox in order to kill off Native Americans. Let's focus on how profound an impact these New World crops had upon the world by focusing on the humble potato. Originally cultivated by the Incas to feed their mountain-born empire, these New World tubers were selectively bred over hundreds of years, and today there are about 1,000 different cultivars, each with different characteristics, including the type of potato, the style, the flavor, the growing conditions, the immunities, the flavors. I already mentioned flavors, sorry. The Incas relied upon these differences in case a blight or some kind of pest, like an insect, took out one particular variety, there were at least some others planted elsewhere that still thrived. Nutritionally, the potato is a huge powerhouse. Some varieties can grow in very poor soil. All of them have high levels of potassium, vitamins, minerals, lots of starch. They are a part of the nightshade family, and many of the pests native to Europe at the time were unable to affect it very much. Harsh weather didn't seem to kill off the potato plant, and potatoes could be stored in a cool, dry place for months and still be edible. Potatoes made meals and nutrition much easier for impoverished rural areas, such as in Russia, parts of Germany, Belgium, and famously in Ireland. As more rural workers relied upon the potato for sustenance, landlords could then devote more land to wheat, barley, or even sheep grazing. The potato was in many ways a blessing and a curse to the poor workers of Europe. Let me give you an example. Rural Irish men at the beginning of World War I were generally taller and had more muscle mass than their city living counterparts, even when the same level of income was accounted for. But the reliance upon a single type of potato, in this case in Ireland, the lumper potato, as well as some English economic and social policies, led to the infamous Irish potato famine of the 1840s. Now, this new world trading system, this Columbian exchange, had its cost, however. Growing the products were very labor intensive, like tobacco, for example, and took a toll on those who wished to make a living in the New World. Getting from Europe to the Western Hemisphere was definitely not cheap. It was definitely not easy. And many a successful, what we would call now middle class, back then they would have been known as the middling sort, would have had few motivations to uproot their comfortable existence and take a dangerous journey to the Western Hemisphere and toil in the sun day after day in hostile lands. But labor was needed. One solution was to offer land or incentives to people to come to the New World. Many who already had money and doing well in the West sponsored workers to come over. In exchange for a set number of years, they would have free passage to come over to the New World and a parting gift at the end, kind of like a severance pay, usually in the form of seeds or land or sheep or something like that, with which they could use to start their own lives in this new world. This concept became known as indentured servitude, but it proved insufficient to meet labor demands. Another solution, one pioneered when Spain crewed Columbus's ship, was to transport criminals to the New World and work off their debt to society as laborers. This solution persisted until the mid 20th century in some places. The criminal could be anything from a hardened murderer, a psychopath, a traitor, or it could be a woman forced to turn to prostitution to support her family, a child caught stealing bread to stave off starvation, you name it. So the influx of criminal laborers was varied, and their abilities were also varied. Um, that and the logistics of getting them to the New World proved insufficient, especially since these criminals could and often did escape their so-called masters and then disappear into the wider population because they could blend in. Slavery was nothing new to Europeans and was initially focused upon natives of the land, especially by the Spanish. The ravages of disease and the ability of the natives to also successfully run away meant that other slaves were required. African slavery began as a kind of indentured servitude, but very quickly became something lifelong and racially based. Unlike Europeans or natives, Africans uprooted from their continent found it difficult to successfully blend in with the other predominant populations of the New World. Moreover, there were language barriers, disorientation, separation from peers and family that made slavery extremely difficult to escape for Africans. Those communities that did escape, such as the Maroon communities of the Caribbean, only did so through extreme hardship and were protected by isolation and avoidance of Europeans and natives alike. Some did go on to become pirates, some were freed, some did return to Africa, but by and large, Africans were treated as subhuman for over 400 years. By the 17th century, the settlement of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans was well established. The original explorers of Europe, Spain and Portugal, respectively, had arrived at a kind of treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Tordesillas, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which basically split the world in two. Spain would get the Western Hemisphere, while Portugal would be able to trade in the Eastern Hemisphere, like Asia, India, and Africa. It didn't really hold, especially because Spain then goes on to violate that treaty, but that's a story for later on. Spain's hold on the Western Hemisphere was also challenged by other newcomers, such as France, England, and the Netherlands. Though explicitly forbidden from trading with each other, these colonies were so isolated and so distant from the homeland that it was difficult to ensure survival. The first answer, of course, to ensure survival is to engage in smuggling. You ignore the official order not to trade with the enemy, and smugglers were adept at getting what was needed to whomever was needed by trading across societies. They did so under threat of being hanged, shot, sunk, or imprisoned for very long periods of time, but it was also very lucrative. Smuggling became an integral part of the colonial Western Hemisphere experience. Such as in the colonies that would later become the American states in the 18th century. Many of the founding fathers, for example, had quite a bit of money either directly or indirectly invested in smuggling. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you basically get the idea. So if smuggling was a gray area, it was not the only one in the Western Hemisphere. Some of the smaller, weaker nations turned to stealing from their rivals. A great example of this is England under Elizabeth I, whose on-again, off-again lover, Sir Walter Raleigh, was a pirate, as was another lover of hers, Sir Francis Drake. And later on, her successor would hire Sir Henry Morgan. Do you see a theme in these names? Being a privateer, which was basically a state-sanctioned pirate, not only siphoned off some of the wealth and trade from those larger rivals such as Spain, but also enriched the individual, got them titles, made them nobility. Now, since our gray area is getting more and more murky, let's get even darker and turn to piracy. While privateering was sanctioned thievery of rivals, pirates were basically working class getting in on the action for their own enrichment. Piracy is really as old as seaborne trade, but piracy in the Western Hemisphere had a new mutation. Lured over either through promises of a new life or transported for penal reasons or for debt or for whatever, there were many unemployed Europeans in the New World. Some of these Europeans knew the shipping lanes, knew the routes, and knew the schedules themselves. And they decided that it was time to take matters in their own hand and become, we'll call them freelance wealth redistribution specialists. Pirates were drawn from sailors as well who had been in navies or on merchant vessels. Some were fishermen, and some were those who turned to a life of crime in order not to starve to death or be imprisoned again for debt. Pirates, by accounts of the time, were painted as madmen, Satanists, bloodthirsty, cruel individuals to a man. Modern investigations, however, paint a different and kind of more nuanced picture. They could be cruel, absolutely, but no more so than on the Royal Navies or merchant captain ships of the time. And they were relatively egalitarian, with divisions of power, votes, and even impeachment proceedings should an officer prove ineffectual or tyrannical. There were men pirates, women pirates, gay pirates who actually got married and would name each other as beneficiaries. They had unemployment. They had workman's compensation. If you lost a hand, you got this much. If you lost a leg, you got that much. Lost an eye, got so much more. So essentially, pirates practiced a direct form of democracy in the New World hundreds of years before the United States even came into being. So in conclusion, sustained contact with Asia, India, and the Western Hemisphere was revolutionary not just for Europe, but for the world. Europeans gained new lands and new wealth, improved their technology, and were able to compete on the world stage for the first time. Asia, Africa, and the Middle East saw an influx of new foods, goods, and luxuries that disrupted centuries-old trading patterns. Indigenous tribes found themselves welcoming hosts, exploited victims, and targets of unheard of diseases by and large. But they also became adapters of new animals, new technologies, and even influenced their European neighbors profoundly. For example, as I mentioned before with the pirates practicing democracy, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people also practiced a form of democracy that Ben Franklin would use to help inform the formation of the Continental Congress. Africans were uprooted and transported to strange lands where their very humanity was stripped from them, but also contributed to the New World's order, the not only as slaves, but also as free people in their own right. They would later go on to become revolutionaries, fighting in the American Revolution, fighting in the Haitian Revolution, fighting in the revolutions in South America. They would also become inventors and thinkers on a global stage. So essentially, the world is different. It is vastly more complex than it had been before the discovery of the Western Hemisphere. That is the end of our lecture today. I would like you to go to the Canvas and look up the additional resources. I've curated a bunch of them for you. So use those to fill in the gaps with the textbook. And don't forget to look in on the quiz and complete it before Sunday. You guys have a good week, and I'll see you again next week.